Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, how are you doing?
You know what, Michael? I'm feeling a bit nauseous today, and Fox, our producer, has just put the fear of God into me by bringing up those E. coli meal deals. So now I'm paranoid and feeling sick.
Yeah, it's worrying. Everyone always thinks it's going to be the meat, but it's actually the salad leaves that make you the sickest. They're in some popularly distributed sandwiches and wraps. People are getting E. coli from them. You can look up the full product list on the web, but I'm hoping by now they've withdrawn them all from the shelves. And if you've eaten one, you've eaten one. So there's not much you can do. Coming up later in the show, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dissolved his war cabinet. The Greek Coastguard has been accused of causing the deaths of dozens of migrants. It's a really, really shocking story from the BBC. And Labour are still refusing to axe the Tory two-child benefit cap, and opposition to that is really growing. Nigel Farage has launched Reform UK's election manifesto, but they're not calling it one.
We're going through a breakdown of trust in politics, where manifestos, one after another, can keep making the same promises, and no one believes now, frankly, a word that they say, which is why today specifically is not a manifesto launch. Because if I say to you manifesto, your immediate word association is lie.
They're not calling it a manifesto. It looks a lot like a manifesto, but they're calling it a contract. They sort of signed it at the end, even though I think they were having problems with their Sharpie working. The so-called contract covers the usual range of topics at a general election: public services, the economy, security and education, amongst others. But as you'd expect from Farage's outfit, there was one theme that was highlighted throughout.
I've said from the start, this should be the immigration election. I have no doubt about that. I think the population explosion, the impact that it's had on people's lives, is the dominant issue. How can you discuss NHS waiting lists without discussing the fact that the population has risen by 6 million people since David Cameron came to power back in 2010? How can you talk about a shortage of housing when we need to build one new dwelling every 2 minutes just to cope with current levels of net migration? How can you talk about any of these things? So we believe this is what we should be talking about. But of course, the others would rather not discuss it. The Conservatives are attempting for a fifth manifesto in a row to tell us they'll reduce the numbers. But then they told us in 2010 and 2015 and 2017 they'd reduce net migration to tens of thousands a year. They promised in 2019, with Brexit controls, we'd massively reduce the levels of unskilled labour coming into Britain. Well, it's running at getting on for net 750,000 a year. And when you look at those that have come and stayed, it's incredible to think that 1 in 30 people on the streets of Britain today have come here in the last 2 years alone.
Now, I disagree with Nigel Farage on basically everything when it comes to immigration, but you can see how the Tories have given him the opportunity to say this. He is right that now for 4 manifestos in a row, they have promised that they will reduce migration, and every time it's massively increased. In the last couple of years, it's been the highest it has ever been. Now, I think that's, says a good thing about the British economy. It says people want to come and work here. But if you want to have high levels of migration, you're also going to have high levels of house building, for example. You might have to invest in infrastructure. And the Tory failure to do any of that does mean that, yeah, some people will be getting a bit pissed off. I think we should embrace that. You can have, I think, a pessimistic view of the economy. We say we can't possibly build any more houses, so we'll have to stop people coming here and building better lives for themselves. Or you can say, well, people want to come here and build better lives for themselves. Let's build some more houses then. To be fair, that is a bit more what the Labour Party is saying. It's just they're not really putting their money where their mouths are. In their manifesto, Reform says they'll put an immediate stop to non-essential immigration. They don't say how they're defining essential. They also pledge to deal with small boat crossings by leaving the European Court of Human Rights and then returning migrants crossing the Channel to France. They then say they'll stop anyone arriving from a safe country from being allowed to claim asylum in the UK, which sounds a lot like abandoning our obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention. That's key. So this idea that they'll just return the boats to France, it's not the European Convention on Human Rights which is stopping us do that. It's just bog standard, basic international law that everyone signed up to. You're not allowed to just dump people in someone else's country without their permission. So if we were to go ahead and just start doing that without France agreeing to it, you'd have some kind of trade war. I mean, it would get pretty dramatic. Part of the party's reasoning around migration came up again when Farage addressed the state of Britain's economy.
We also have to try and find out a way that people can be better off. National government, opposition, much of the media seems to want to bow down to the god of GDP. Our gross domestic product rose last year. Isn't that great? Well, if you massively increase the population, it's perhaps not surprising with more people that the overall size of the economy would grow. But here's the key. Coinciding with record levels of migration into Britain, we have now seen 6 consecutive quarters of GDP per head falling. We're getting poorer. The mass import of cheap, unskilled foreign labour may work for your big multinational company who want as cheap a labour as possible and couldn't give a damn about the social consequences, but it's not working. And we very much want to be a party that is on the side of working people.
So he made a critique there that might sound like something you often hear on Novara media. So we're often sort of debunking those claims from the Conservative Party to say the British economy is growing, because we say, well, actually, it's not growing if you look at this per capita. The only reason the economy looks like it's growing is because the population has increased, which is, as Nigel Farage says, basically because of immigration. I think the problem there is that Nigel Farage suggests that migration is stopping growth, whereas in fact, it's the migration numbers are being used to disguise a lack of growth. So when the government does stand up and say we're growing, they are essentially being dishonest, because actually we're just increasing the number of us. So individually, none of us are getting richer. But the answer isn't to then say, okay, we'll stop people coming in so we can no longer mask the real figures. It's to say, well, let's just be honest with people and maybe invest in the economy. Farage promised to immediately put money in the pockets of workers by raising the threshold for basic rate of income tax from £12,500 to £20,000. That's a massive tax cut. He said that would take around 7 million people out of income tax altogether, and save the average worker £1,500 a year. So this is big money. But in the manifesto, Reform is offering higher earners a sweetener too, with a pledge to raise the higher rate of tax threshold to £70,000 rather than the current £50,000. As you'd expect, there are also a lot of pro-business tax cuts too. Reform has promised to reduce corporation tax from 25% to 15% over 3 years, which would put the UK far below the average for the G7, OECD, EU and BRICS groups. Now, those are some huge, huge tax giveaways. There are also spending cuts on offer, though, with the one of the biggest coming from climate budgets.
We're pursuing net zero policies that are self-destructive. Just look at what it's doing to industry. What's happening to steel making in South Wales? It's going. But somehow government thinks that's good because we reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that we emit. But we don't. We just export the production of that CO2 as the goods are made somewhere else. In this case, I'm particularly talking about primary, not secondary steel. And then we import the goods back into our country. So we want to get rid of the subsidies that are paid to green energy companies by loading taxes on the electricity bills of everybody in this country. And we've been doing this now for the best part of 20 years.
Again, there he said something which I often hear sort of on the left when people are criticising our government, which is to say we haven't actually reduced emissions, we've just exported them. So we're not actually a greener economy, we're just importing more manufacturing, and the only reason we've lowered our emissions is because of that. Now, whether someone says that on the left or whether someone says that on the right, it's untrue either way, right? It ever so slightly sort of reduces the amount of emissions reductions that we've had if you include imported emissions, but not by much. So I think our emissions have sort of halved since the 90s. And then if you include imported emissions, something like it's fallen by 45%, right? So our emissions have radically decreased over the past couple of decades, whether or not you include sort of imported emissions. So he's just flat out wrong there. On the NHS, Farage blamed migration, as you can imagine, for contributing to long waiting lists. But he also said this about his plans for the health service.
And with the big one, the NHS, look, what we are going to campaign for is a genuine radical rethink. You know, we all grew up loving the NHS, being deeply grateful to the NHS. It was there and a fantastic thing. And I've been trying to make many of these arguments, actually, I've been trying to make for well over a decade, that we have to have a rethink. And I think perhaps back in 2015, when I led a different party in a general election, perhaps I was just a bit ahead of the curve. Perhaps I was saying things that people didn't want to listen to. But I get the sense that they are listening now. We are not getting bang for our buck. And there's a growing level of disenchantment that the health service simply isn't fit for purpose in the way that and not just the way that it used to be, the way that we want it to be. So let's look at other funding models. Let's look at how the French do it. Let's be radical in our thinking.
So elsewhere, sort of in the speech, he said, what we all want for the NHS is for it to be free at the point of use, but I don't really care who's providing it. Now, that's not actually the French model. The French model, you do have co-payments, you do have sort of social insurance, and you do have private insurance. So I'm not sure he's being quite honest with the public in terms of the model he has in mind. There wasn't loads of detail. I have to say there were big ideas, even if they're bad ideas. The manifesto does, as a whole, or I should call it the contract, I suppose, give a better idea of where reform plans to go. They've pledged a 0% basic tax rate for all frontline NHS staff for 3 years, hoping to retain existing staff and attract those who've left to come back. So say if you work in the NHS, you won't have to pay any tax. They're also promising big tax breaks to private health companies, offering 20% tax relief on private healthcare providers and insurers. Ash, a mixture of populist policies and then relatively, I think, unpopular ones. So sort of saying we're going to tinker with the NHS funding model, which, you know, whatever you think about it, you know, the French model does seem to work quite well. I personally think switching from one to the other would be a mistake, but it's not popular with the public. We can say that very clearly. Then the stuff on migration obviously is going to be, you know, it's going to have some cut through with certain people. The overwhelming thing here, though, I thought was how economically, I suppose, right wing it was. Right, it was like a Liz Truss budget, but coming from people who, you know, are trying to speak to the red wall. Something a bit sort of odd about it.
You know what? I've made the mistake of underestimating Nigel Farage before. So around, 2017, 2018, 2019, I looked at Nigel Farage's attempts to stand as an MP and the fact that he failed every time. And I said, aha, you're a political failure. And that was really, really dumb of me, to put it bluntly. It was just really, really stupid because it failed to look at the precise way that he's worked to reshape British politics without ever once having to, constrain himself by being in the House of Commons. So I would always say that with Nigel Farage, always work against your instinct to underestimate him. And that's something which I've had to learn the hard way. I think when it comes to what he's doing, the power of Farage is not so much what are the individual policies, because as you correctly point out, Michael, most of them are actually quite unpopular. He's trying to stand on a contract, a manifesto, which is promising, bigger tax cuts than Liz Truss, completely, repulsive electorally platform when it comes to the NHS. And still, he's, probably by far and away the single most popular individual politician in the country. The power of Farage is not in individual policies, but his ability to put together a political narrative which has a track record of pushing parties to implement the things that he wants to do. And I think what's dangerous about what he's doing, and in some ways it's a replay of what Vote Leave did, right? It's different from leave.eu, but Vote Leave did in the Brexit referendum, which is correctly identify the unfairness of globalization and the way in which it's taken away jobs and control from various regions around the UK, say things which are true about the pervasive sense of national decline and declining quality of our infrastructure and public services, and then say, okay, well, the big red button that you press is lower immigration and scrapping net zero targets. And that's the really dangerous thing, is that he's able to sort of connect together material conditions that would ordinarily benefit left-wing politicians and left-wing parties to right-wing projects. That's the thing that he does so well. And is there anyone, on the political stage at the moment who's capable of taking that on? I don't think so. The thing which really struck me about the Vox Pop video that our colleague Claire Heimer did down in Clacton, where of course Nigel Farage is standing to be an MP, is that there was a Green Party candidate who I thought said all the right things. And in terms of her analysis, I was like, yeah, I really agree with you. But she sounded like a wet vegetarian. And Nigel Farage is a fucking shark. His sell to people is, I hate the same people you hate, and I'll do it really, really effectively. And so that's in his power, that sense of personal charisma, the way in which he weaves a political story, and his ability to shift the major parties, mostly the Conservative Party, into adopting elements of his platform. And I think as we enter into a Starmer government with a very weak Conservative Party, that might be something to really watch out for, that he effectively can tell a populist story, weave a populist narrative and then income all these unpopular policies behind it.
As we said, we were talking about the sort of Liz Truss comparison. Worth noting, actually, Nigel Farage was quite a big fan of Liz Truss at the time. People should bring that up more. And the comparison between the Liz Truss mini budget and this contract was asked at the launch.
Mr. Farage, in your contracts, you're proposing to spend an extra £141 billion every year. That's about 30 times the amount that Labour are going to spend. So they're going to spend 10 times the amount the Tories, 3 times the amount that Liz Truss promised to spend. You did say that you weren't going to win the next election, but the scale of this, it's deeply unserious, isn't it?
That's right. It's radical. It's fresh thinking. It's outside the box. It's not what you're going to get for the current Labour and Conservative parties, who are virtually indistinguishable, frankly, from each other. Is this radical fresh thinking on economics? Yes. Is it radical fresh thinking on constitutional change? Yes. Is it very radical change on the way our education system is currently bringing up our young children? Yes. Britain is broken. Britain needs reform. That's what we're here for. That's what we're trying to do. And Richard has also suggested some very interesting radical changes to pay for it. We're unashamedly radical. We want change. This isn't working, and nobody has got political arguments in this election it's basically more of the same. It is going to be a Labour government. We all know that. I said that 2 weeks ago when I came back, when Richard passed me the ball or the hand grenade that was fizzing or whatever it was. And I said that 2 weeks ago, that Labour are going to win. This is about who the opposition's going to be. And what we're talking about is what we're going to fight for over the course of the next 5 years. So, no, there's no rowing back from me, no apologies from me on this whatsoever. This would represent a fundamental transformational change within the British economy.
But to be clear for those who are watching on the live stream, Sam, yes, there's some series of spendings, costs, but we also outline all of the savings that I've just touched on there. So it's very important that you look at both sides of the coin. As Nigel says, it's not working. People are getting poorer. Unless we change course, we are heading towards disaster. That's the point.
So Richard Tyser sort of pointed at the contract and said, all the sums have been done, the numbers add up. When you look at the costings page in the contract, though, it doesn't give much detail. So this is the costings document. It just says the policy area on one side, an amount that's supposedly going to be saved on the other. So it says, apparently, lower immigration will save us £5 billion a year, even though most economists say that would cost us more money if we sort of reduced migration. They say getting rid of net zero will apparently save 30 billion a year. I don't know where they've sort of pulled that number from. General cuts to government departments will apparently save 50 billion a year, and will apparently save 35 billion by changing the rules at the Bank of England. Now, some of the stuff about the Bank of England is interesting. I imagine we'll hear similar stuff from Labour as well. This argument about cuts to budget to government departments, though, is where this is the most ridiculous, because they basically just said this is all get paid by every government department becoming 5% more productive. And so that means, they said, if they all become 5% more productive, then we save £50 billion a year. Done. Brilliant. So the idea that counts as sort of costing, you just say, okay, well, why not say they'll all get 10% more productive, and then you've got twice as much money to play with, right? You can't just pull a number out of a hat and say, oh, we're going to save that much. I mean, in practice, obviously, what this would mean, they wouldn't become 5% more productive. They would just have further austerity done to them, and a level of austerity which is harsher than either that which the Labour Party or the Conservative Party are offering. So that would be a disaster. Sort of as I often say on this show, people often assume that if you cut budgets, that will create more efficiency, because people think, we've got to do the same amount with less. How can we possibly make ourselves a more efficient organisation? What it often does is the opposite, because you end up doing what you're doing very badly. So the asylum example is one I always give. So what austerity at the Home Office did is basically make loads of people redundant who were going through people's claims. Then you're not going through people's claims. Oh God, what we got now? We got loads of people who have been waiting for 5 years for their claim to get heard. We're going to have to put them up in a very expensive hotel. So you can't just say, well, if we give them less money, they'll work out how to be more efficient. No, if you give them less money, the whole thing might just collapse. Of course, you might ask, does it matter what Reform UK say they want at this election? Even Farage admits the party has no chance of winning, and they're unlikely to get many MPs. But according to Nigel Farage, the party is playing a longer game.
So if there were to be an election then in 2029, the next election after this one, you would be the head of that. Would that mean that you would be vying at that election to be Prime Minister?
Yes, absolutely. I think the disconnect between the Labour and Conservative Westminster-based parties and the country, the thoughts, hopes and aspirations of ordinary people are so far apart from where our politics is. And the funny thing is they show no signs of changing. I mean, I was in those 7-way debates, one on the BBC, one on ITV, and the more that Angela Rayner argued with Penny Mordaunt, the more they sounded the same. There are no real fundamental differences between these two parties.
Can I just pick you up?
We are aiming to be a big party.
I mean, he did have a reasonable point in that debate. Whenever you did hear Angela Rayner and Penny Mordaunt, they would always sound the same, because Penny Mordaunt would be saying, you're going to do this, that. And Angela Rayner would say, no, we're not. She's saying, we're not going to increase taxes. We're not going to increase spendings. And she's sort of trying to say they will. And they're saying, no, we won't, which makes you think, well, then why vote for you? Farage, as you heard, there was very critical of both Labour and the Tories. But speaking to Sky today, he refused to rule out joining the latter.
You are ruling out joining the Conservative Party, even if you're an MP in the next Parliament, at any point. I just want a categorical statement to that fact.
That is absolutely not on my agenda. And I can't rule out being dead within 5 years. That's a ridiculous question. You and I both know that's a moronic question to ask.
All I want to say is that people can see from space that right now you are not ruling out becoming a member of the Conservative Party
I will
in the
not
next
become
Parliament.
a member of them. I have no intention of being in the Conservative Party at any point.
No intention is just less specific. I'm sorry to be boring about this.
Do you really think your viewers are interested in this?
Yes.
Do you really?
I think people are interested in the future of politics in this country.
Right, it needs to be the centre-right needs to be reshaped. They've destroyed it. They've taken the party to the centre ground. They're split and divided. That's why we're here.
And the Conservatives are going to invite you in after the next election. Some of them are. But the party
but
is
they're the
split.
minority. They're the minority. They're the small minority. If you think about the Conservative Party, the voices that you talk about, the Suellas, Bravermans, the Robert Jenricks, are a small minority.
OK, I think we can hear that you're not ruling out membership of the Conservative Party.
I might be dead.
OK, but that's not
no idea what
a very clever answer, but it's not the answer. It's not a categorical answer to what we're...
I mean, honestly, this is so in the weeds, isn't it, really?
I wouldn't be asking it if I didn't think it was a relevant question in 17 days' time when the election has taken...
Well, all right, fair enough. It's not relevant to me.
It's not relevant to me. I mean, it's definitely something he's been thinking about. Ash, do you believe that Nigel Farage just hasn't... It's not relevant to him. He hasn't It hasn't even crossed his mind that he might join the Conservatives after the election. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. I mean, who's to say? He doesn't know if he's going to be dead tomorrow. What did you make of that exchange?
Well, look, again, it's about looking clearly at Nigel Farage and considering what his strengths are. One of his strengths is that he's got no particular sense of loyalty to the political party form or parliamentary democracy, right? And so that's allowed him to use vehicles like UKIP and the Brexit Party basically as ways to shape the politics of another party, right? That's what he did. It wasn't about UKIP being able to form a government. It wasn't about the Brexit Party getting MPs. It was basically about, okay, how do I use this particular vehicle to achieve my particular aims? Now, when it comes to Reform, I think that they're doing something different. It does seem to me that Reform want to win in Clacton. And also, when you look at where they're focusing their campaigning, so Clacton, of course, but you've also got Barnsley, which is a Labour-held seat, launching their manifesto, contract in Merthyr Tydfil, which, as we know, has been massively impacted by deindustrialization, but it's also home to an asylum hotel. So he's picking these places very, very carefully. It does seem to me that Farage wants a seat in Parliament. Now, what's he going to do with it? Is he going to represent the best interests of Reform Party and Reform Party members? Hell no. That's never been within Nigel Farage's MO. Reform Party has basically been set up more like a company, more like a corporate structure, which allows the executive suite at the top an awful lot of autonomy and very little in the way of democracy or input for its party members. You don't really sign up to be a Reform Party member the way that you might, a Green Party member or the Labour Party or, even a Conservative Party member. You sign up because you're a fan. That's what it's about. It's about, lending your name and your voice and your presence to bolster up the impact and the power of someone else who basically decides what they're going to do. It's an endorsement of Nigel Farage personally. So once he gets into Parliament, if he gets into Parliament, I should say, he's absolutely going to consider what's the most advantageous thing to do. Is it to be effectively an independent voice within Parliament? Is it to try and, mount a sort of right-wing headbanger coup within the Conservative Party? He's going to leave himself maximum wriggle room to do that. I think that's also why it took a little bit of time for him to swing into action and take over leadership of the Reform Party and decide that he wanted to stand. It's all about wriggle room. So he's not going to rule anything out. That's simply not his style.
He's keeping his options open. We want to make sure we're as large as possible whenever he does that to stop him controlling British politics. This channel is purely or nearly entirely funded by our viewers. If you are already a regular donor, thank you so much. If not, go to novaramedia.com/support. You can donate whatever you can afford. The link is in the description. We really do appreciate it. Let's go on to our next story. The Greek Coastguard has caused the deaths of dozens of migrants in the Mediterranean over a 3-year period, according to a new report by the BBC. The deadly pushback operations all took place between 2020 and 2023. And in that time, the BBC has verified that 9 migrants drowned after being deliberately thrown into the sea. So they report this. In 5 of the incidents, migrants said they were thrown directly into the sea by the Greek authorities. In 4 of those cases, they explained how they had landed on Greek islands but were hunted down. In several other incidents, migrants said they had been put onto inflatable rafts without motors, which then deflated or appeared to have been punctured. Now, note that this is people who found their way to dry land and then were taken back out to sea and then thrown into the sea. Right? It looks a lot like kidnap and murder, right? The BBC report spoke to a number of witnesses who had seen the Greek Coast Guard throw people to their deaths in the sea. So one was a man from Cameroon. He said this: "We had barely docked and the police came from behind. There were 2 policemen dressed in black and 3 others in civilian clothes. They were masked. You could see only their eyes." So again, these are police and Coast Guard. They're not marked what they're wearing, and they're they've got balaclavas on. You can only see their eyes, and they're kidnapping people before throwing them into the sea. I mean, it's like something from a gangster movie. This man, along with 2 other migrants, was then detained and transferred to a Greek Coastguard boat and driven out to sea. He said this about what happened next. So they started with the other Cameroonian. They threw him in the water. The Ivorian man said, "Save me, I don't want to die." And then eventually only his hand was above water and his body was below. Slowly his hand slipped under and the water engulfed him. And the interviewee was also thrown into the water but managed to swim to shore. The 2 men he was detained with and taken out to sea with, they both drowned. Another man from Somalia this time told the BBC he had been handcuffed before being thrown in the water. He said this, "They threw me zip-tied in the middle of the sea. They wanted me to die." That interviewee managed to break free and swim to the Turkish shore. 3 of the men he was detained with drowned. So obviously we're only hearing the witness statements from survivors. There'll be many people who went through such horrific experiences who didn't make it. They died. They were murdered, essentially, it seems, by the Greek Coastguard. The BBC documentary, I really do recommend watching it. It also addressed an incident reported on by the New York Times last year. So this is the headline from the New York Times. Greece says it doesn't ditch migrants at sea. It was caught in the act. And then it says video evidence shows asylum seekers, among them young children, being rounded up, taken to sea and abandoned on a raft by the Greek Coast Guard. This is from May 2023. We did cover it on the show at the time. And the video evidence that was sort of collected by the New York Times showed 12 migrants, including men, women, children, and an infant, being unloaded from an unmarked van. They're then forced onto a Coast Guard speedboat by masked men before being driven out to Turkish waters and being dumped in an inflatable life raft. That footage was incredibly significant because while there had been suspicions about Greek pushbacks for years, this was the first time the act was caught on camera, so it could no longer be denied. The BBC documentary, really interesting, documents the difficulty the journalist who recorded that footage had in acquiring it. And that included being stopped by a hooded and unmarked police officer, sort of as he's driving down the road. Seems really terrifying. He's then arrested, sort of taken into custody because they don't want anyone around documenting what they're doing. He managed to get the footage on a separate occasion. They also showed the footage we just showed you there to the former head of special operations with the Greece Coast Guard, so a very senior figure in the Greek Coast Guard. This is how he responded.
I can see people getting on board the vessel. It doesn't seem like it's forceful.
Can you see any small children?
Yes, now I can. That's something that happens. The migrants traveling the Aegean Sea, very often they abandon the children. They don't seem to have the same affection that we have for children.
Do you have any questions about that video?
I don't. Do you need to understand something? That's not me trying to hide something. There are hundreds of videos showing the Greek Coast Guard saving people. Why save someone and let someone else die?
Should we take a break?
Yeah.
Have a cup of tea?
Yeah, it's a good moment.
Yeah, great.
I'll visit the loo. Δεν τους έχω πει πολλά, Για πες. Ξεκάθαρα αυτό, εντάξει. Τι να πω όμως αυτός. Ξέρεις, απ' έξω βλέποντάς το, είναι ξεκάθαρο τι γίνεται. Δεν είναι. Δεν θέλει πυρηνική φυσική. Δεν ξέρω γιατί το κάνανε για μέρα μεσημέρι όλος. Δεν ξέρω τι... Ξεκάθαρα παράνομο, προφανώς. Προφανώς παράνομο. Διεθνές έγκλημα, διεθνές αδίκημα.
So if you're listening on the podcast, so couldn't see the subtitles there, when he didn't think the BBC were listening to what he said to an associate, "I haven't told them too much, have I? I don't know why they did it in broad daylight. It's clearly illegal. It's obviously an international crime." So he's sort of telling the BBC, "Oh no, this could be anyone. Who knows who are the people in the balaclavas who are pushing these migrant families out to sea and dumping them in Turkish waters. It could be anyone. Also notice what he says. We shouldn't assume. And if I don't know they're the Greek Coast Guard, then I shouldn't assume. But when they're asking him about this baby being taken onto this boat to be left out at sea, I mean, just even saying those words, a baby left out to sea in a life raft, he says, oh, they don't care about their kids. Right, so he's happy to draw conclusions there without any evidence. But when it comes to people who are clearly from the Greek Coast Guard and the Greek police who are pushing people out to sea, then suddenly, oh, what could I possibly say? Ash, I think really powerful evidence that the BBC have collected here. It's an hour and a half documentary film. I really recommend people watching it. So much to say, I suppose, especially in that interview there, I suppose the dehumanization of those people. So one saying they don't care about their kids, and then just being very, very willing to lie to an international broadcaster and say, I see no problems with what's going on there, when he knows it's illegal. And his only concern is that they were stupid enough to do it in broad daylight. When I say they, I mean the Coast Guard, of course.
I mean, where to start with it? I think for me, the part that I found utterly disgusting was when this, former Greek Coast Guard said, oh, these migrants, they often abandon their children. They don't seem to have the same affection for them as we do. And I think that there is some version of that dehumanization and demonization of migrants that is not unique to the Greek Coast Guard. It's something which you see in UK politics as well. It's something that you see in French far-right politics, Italian far-right politics. This idea that migrants are making dangerous crossings, whether it's across the Med or across the Channel, because fundamentally they don't have a very high regard for their lives, the lives of their children or the lives of their loved ones. And it's a form of racism, basically. It's a way of saying, you're not human like the rest of us. You don't have the same bonds of human affection or human loyalty, a human regard for life, because you're basically inferior. You're inferior people. Whatever you're doing, whatever's happening to you is your own fault. I mean, I remember Vox popping people in Barking in 2016, and someone said, well, these Syrians, they're drowning themselves. And I just thought, there's a whole system of dehumanization that's gone into someone being able to say that. This was around the time that the images of the toddler Aylan Kurdi, really deeply distressing images of his dead body having been washed up. So to look at that and to go, you've done this to yourself, or your parents did this to you, I think just shows how the machinery of racism kicks in so that you can defend the utterly indefensible. I think when it comes to the act of, rounding up these would-be migrants, dragging them out on an inflatable raft. Also reports from that documentary that some of the inflatable rafts are deliberately punctured or sabotaged so that they'll sink. This is something being done by the Greek Coast Guard. It's something which is happening at the behest of European countries in general. We've seen utterly horrendous, treatment of migrants at sea by the very same services who should be rescuing anyone who is imperiled on the sea. We saw that with a very famous case investigated by Forensic Architecture, which sort of showed that a boat of migrants who drowned and died were deliberately ignored. Had multiple opportunities to be rescued, multiple opportunities, and those they were ignored because basically the principle is, well, we don't want you here. Now, the way to stop, would-be refugees from making that kind of crossing, there's multiple elements to it. One is, it would be really great if we stopped exporting arms around the world, which contributes to the destabilization of, countries all over the place. If we stop propping up dictators, and if we, treated climate change like the emergency it is, so that people don't have to, flee their homelands because, food is too expensive, water is more precarious. Those things would all be great. Another part of it is safe and legal routes, because nobody's first choice is a dinghy. That's not how anybody wants to make a crossing into Europe. That wouldn't be anyone's first choice of doing it. So what we've done is, as the West, we want it all ways. We want to be able to make money from human misery all around the world. We don't want to take in the people who are fleeing that human misery. So we say, okay, no safe and legal routes for you. And then when people are, I think, doing something which any of us would do, I mean, I think that if we were pushed to that level of extremity because of the conditions we were fleeing, I think lots of people would make the choice to just, roll the dice, at least on a chance of a better life. We see those images and we go, okay, well, this proves to us that you're inferior people, the very fact that you're doing this. And that's what I think we mean when we talk about structural racism. It's where the belief that these people are less human than us, it plays out at every level of state and EU decision making, all the way from the very top of policy to then the sort of foot soldiers on the ground rounding up these migrants and dragging them back into Turkish waters.
And it is also interesting because, I mean, you watch that and, the people sound, I've got no idea about that guy's politics, but it sounded sort of far right adjacent, sort of the language he was using. Obviously, the far right are very significant in Greece. But the bureaucrats in Greece, the bureaucrats in Brussels aren't really going to mind that these people are doing their dirty work, I think, because obviously once people get to within the EU, then that becomes Europe's problem. They're already trying to battle the far right. So, I mean, they show clips in the documentary. By the way, I haven't told you what it's called. It's called Dead Calm, Killing in the Med. We'll have 90 minutes of your time. They sort of show clips of the president of the European Commission sort of saying, the Greeks are doing a great job. And I don't think that anyone in Brussels will be sort of saying what we want you to do is take out these people to Turkish waters and then puncture your boats. But I don't think they're going to be in the mood to say, Greece, you need to treat these migrants more fairly, because I think they're going to be like, well, if someone else is going to do the dirty work, thank you. It's the impression I get. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dissolved the country's war cabinet following the resignation of the more moderate Benny Gantz. But the move to end the war cabinet isn't being taken as an indication that Israel is any closer to ending the war. Instead, the Jerusalem Post reports this. The move is seen by most observers as Netanyahu's strategy of deflecting the demand by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich to be added to the war cabinet. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir both criticised the war cabinet in recent months, arguing that it was not acting aggressively enough against Hamas in Gaza and against Hezbollah on Israel's northern border. Both have advocated a full-scale invasion into some that would include capturing territory as well as building in Gaza, which would be absolutely catastrophic. It's, of course, a reference to Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, and both members of Netanyahu's government, whose genocidal statements were raised as evidence in South Africa's case against Israel in the International Court of Justice. Netanyahu presumably judging that inviting them into the war cabinet as opposed to just the cabinet would maybe be a step too far when it comes to sort of backing from the United States. Netanyahu's move also comes against a backdrop of growing civic concerns about the conduct of the war. Tens of thousands of Israelis gathered at protests in Tel Aviv over the weekend. They're calling for the government to reach a ceasefire deal, to hold elections and to end Netanyahu's time in office. At the same time, tensions are mounting on the border with Lebanon, and that's a situation that's making the United States nervous. US President Joe Biden has sent his envoy Amos Hochstein to the region to try to prevent an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah. Interestingly, Hochstein is holding meetings with Netanyahu, but also with Benny Gantz. But negotiating for a peace settlement with Hezbollah isn't going to be easy without a change in direction of Israel's government. Haaretz reports this. Senior US officials admit that the end of war in Gaza and the release of the Israeli hostages held by Hamas are the primary prerequisites for reaching an agreement in the north. Without real progress towards a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, it will be difficult to reach an agreement with Hezbollah, as the Lebanese terror organization has made it clear that it will continue to fight Israel as long as the war in Gaza continues. Of course, I kind of object to a terror organization unless we use the same term, the IDF. The latest possible deal between Israel and Hamas now appears to be in limbo, making the prospects of a war with Hezbollah more likely. But there are also signs that Israel may not have the resources to fight both a war in the south of the country and another one in the north. In the wake of the killing of 8 IDF soldiers in Rafah on Saturday, the military has announced plans to create a new division for retired reservists over the age of 40 in order to meet, quote, the urgent need for more troops. Meanwhile, most Palestinians in Gaza began Eid celebrations on Sunday, but as the celebrations began, at least 7 people were killed in the Barej refugee camp. 5 of those killed were children. Eid comes as a new report reveals that many in Gaza will have lost the family members they'd normally celebrate the holiday with. Associated Press has reported on how the war in Gaza has wiped out entire Palestinian clans. AP has identified 60 extended families that lost 25 members in the first 3 months of the war, some of them across 4 generations. By January, over 300 families in Gaza had lost 10 or more members. Over 300 families had lost 10 or more members. Just sort of a destruction of a people, essentially. That's what we're talking about, isn't it? Labour's strategy of offering the electorate mere crumbs has so far proven to be a vote winner. But their refusal to tax and spend is generating a growing level of concern among NGOs and poverty campaigners. And no element of their campaign is more controversial than their refusal to scrap the 2-child limit for child benefits. Labour's decision to maintain the cap, which was introduced by George Osborne, has already attracted scorn from Gordon Brown and the Archbishop of Canterbury. And now the Institute for Fiscal Studies has added their voice to the chorus. The influential think tank has said the cap will hit an extra 670,000 children if it's not removed in the next 5 years. The policy already affects 2 million children whose households lose out on over £4,000 per year because of the policy. The chief executive of Child Poverty Action has also spoken out, saying this: child poverty in the UK is a national disgrace, and the biggest driver of it is the 2-child limit. It makes life worse for kids up and down the country and limits their future chances. Any government serious about making things better for the next generation will have to scrap the 2-child limit and do so quickly. Labour's Jonathan Ashworth was grilled on his party's position on Good Morning Britain.
As the Institute for Fiscal Studies said, it will lead to rising child poverty in the next year. Hundreds of thousands more poor families losing £4,000 a year because of this 2-child cap if they got more than 2 kids. You called the policy vicious. You said it was a heinous policy. I mean, what's Labour for if it's not for tackling child poverty? Why is this not in the manifesto?
Well, of course, my views on that policy are well known and long-standing. You've just quoted back at me how I've described it in colourful language in the past. But equally, what will do nothing to help alleviate child poverty in this country is for politicians to make unfunded, unaffordable spending commitments. That
Poverty Action Group says the 2-child limit, more than any other policy, has driven child poverty to record levels. These people who are affected can't wait for growth, which you have your fingers crossed to achieve. Angela Rayner says it is obscene and inhumane. And Keir Starmer, back in 2020, said he would scrap it.
Politics.
But the IFS say that your child poverty strategy is going to mean child poverty goes up next year and the year after because you're not scrapping this policy. Isn't politics about choices? In the manifesto, you are spending billions of pounds in a costed way with tax rises. You've just decided not to spend. It's not a priority to tackle the vicious, heinous thing. It just feels as though child poverty just didn't quite make the cut compared to childcare or dentistry or waiting times. Is that really the right choice?
Well, of course, the IFS is making an assessment based on the interaction of the tax and benefit system. They're not looking at the bigger picture of how we're going to grow the economy when we've had...
Why won't you say to us now, if there is better economic growth, then we'll scrap the 2-child policy?
because we are making it very clear that all of our commitments are fully funded and costed. We are not making unfunded commitments.
Very sort of almost surreal watching that, because it was, a tough line of questioning from the host. But obviously one of the hosts is married to one of the guests' colleagues. So Ed Balls is married to Yvette Cooper, who wants to become the Home Secretary. Ed Balls used to be Jonathan Ashworth's colleague when he was Shadow Chancellor. So you've got this sort of pretense of being really tough when, Ed Balls wants the other guy to win. I mean, I suppose he'd put that forward as, so just because I'm married to a Labour politician and just because I'm friends with this guy doesn't mean I'm not going to go tough on him. So he'd say this means that it's all okay. It just seems quite bizarre to watch. The Greens and Lib Dem, sort of on the policy front, have both committed to getting rid of the two-child benefit cap, as has one party leader from the other end of the political spectrum.
I think we should encourage people to have families. I think we should encourage people to have children.
So is that, so they should all be, all of those children.
And I think we should also encourage people in marriage to have some tax benefits as well. I really do.
So that's a yes, a lifting of the two-child.
Yeah, we've got to help people.
That was Nigel Farage speaking at the ITV debate last week. It is worth saying that commitment doesn't seem to have made it into Reform UK's manifesto. So maybe he's not putting his money where his mouth is, even though they're willing to spend shed loads of money in their manifesto. They obviously didn't prioritise that. But I thought the sort of rhetorical device there was interesting. Say, this right-wing party Reform, they're going to go to the left of Labour and the Conservatives on the two-child benefit cap, because they want more people to have kids. I think there's going to be something in that we're going to see more often when it comes to sort of right-wing, what they call it is pro-natalist policies, so policies which encourage people to have kids. Ash, what's going on here? Is this a fight that the Labour Party want to be having? Because they're sort of saying our big sort of pitch to voters is we're not like the other Labour parties you've seen. We're willing to take the tough decisions and say, no, we're not going to spend that, even when everyone's against us.
I mean, look, the basic strategy of the Labour Party is this. It's we want middle-class voters. And when I say middle-class voters, I'm not necessarily talking about simply being culturally middle-class. So having a penchant for, I don't know, what's a middle-class drink these days, right? They all cycle out. Kombucha. Having a penchant for kombucha. Or is that common now? I don't know. It's not about being culturally middle-class. It's basically, do you have some kind of stake in the economy, right? So do you have a mortgage? Do you own an asset? When it comes to low turnout cohorts, so people who are recipients of universal credit, or people who are renting rather than owning their own home, Labour are like, we don't have to make a pitch to you, right? Sure, some of those middle-class voters that we're after will go, oh, we'd really like it if you did these things, but ultimately it's not going to stop them from voting for us, right? That's the electoral calculation they've made. Is it ethical? No. Is it effective? Well, clearly, yes, at least in the short term. What the problem is in the long term is that child poverty is one of the most significant engines of crime, poor mental health, self-harm, serious youth violence. Child poverty is like, it attaches turbo boosters onto all of these issues that your middle class voters are going to think of as being quite important, particularly when, you're thinking about serious youth violence and the way in which that gets politicized. So I think that it's extremely short-termist, even on that very narrow electoral metric, to say, well, we're not going to commit to scrapping the two-child benefit cap. But that's because they've decided units don't matter. They just simply don't matter as much as middle-class voters who want to hear about what you're going to do for first-time buyers. They want to hear from you that you're not going to do anything which is going to push interest rates up even more than they've already gone up. And they definitely want to hear about NHS waiting lists. Now, sure, you might have a ton of pundits going, well, that's smart politics, but I just think that there's something inherently disgusting about refusing to lift. I think it's, thousands and thousands of children out of poverty. I think it might even be like 670,000 children out of poverty by lifting the cap on benefits.
The cap currently apparently condemns 2 million kids to poverty who wouldn't otherwise be in poverty. And then the new data from the IFS is saying that a further 670,000 kids would be put into poverty if the cap is maintained for the next 5 years. I actually do think there is a strong possibility that in their first budget, Labour announced that they've found some sort of small amount of money they can raise somewhere and that they're going to scrap this limit because it's become quite totemic now. And I think it only costs £3.4 billion or something. So I imagine once they get into power, this could be sort of a rabbit they pull out of the hat and sort of say, we told you so. We told you we were very compassionate people. Obviously, I hope they do that. I'm not going to begrudge them to say, why wouldn't you say that before the election? Like, I hope they do. But I think it is important that this sort of this movement of outrage has built up, because obviously that's made it much more likely that they will get rid of the cap once they are elected. Let's wrap up there. Thank you, Ash, for joining me on tonight's show.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to go be sick into a bucket now.
Yeah, I thought we're ending 4 minutes early just because you told me that you're feeling a bit under the weather. I like your thumbs up appearing there. I don't know how you made that happen. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Make sure to come back tomorrow for another stream. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.